Intro. What if the person hired to clean your floors ended up cleaning the grief you buried inside your soul? This is not just another story about wealth, or loss, or a lonely mansion. It's a story about how healing sometimes walks in disguised as something ordinary. And how one young woman, with nothing but silence and kindness, changed a life that billions of dollars could not touch. Adrian Blackwell was a man the world knew as untouchable. At 36, he was a billionaire CEO, the kind of man whose name moved markets. But behind the gates of his sprawling estate, his world had gone quiet. 2 years earlier, he lost his wife in a tragic accident, and with her, every piece of warmth in his life. The mansion he once filled with music, parties, and light had become a tomb of silence. And then came Isabella Moore. 24, a modest young woman just trying to survive, working as a cleaner to pay for her studies. She didn't arrive with promises to heal, nor with grand ambitions. She was just there for a paycheck, but what she gave Adrian was something money could never buy. This is the beginning of Hired to Clean His House. She ended up healing his soul. A deep narrative of grief, silence, and the unexpected power of human connection. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, where we uncover stories that remind us healing doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes, it comes in whispers. Chapter 1: The Silent Mansion. The mansion stood like a monument to a past life, a place where time seemed frozen, as Isabella Moore stepped through its towering doors for the first time. She felt an almost physical weight pressed down on her shoulders. The hallways stretched endlessly, lined with portraits that stared back at her, as if demanding she recognize lives that no longer breathed within these walls. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floors, sharp and lonely, like a sound that didn't belong. She had cleaned small apartments, busy offices, even cheap motels, but nothing like this. This was not a home, it was a mausoleum wrapped in wealth. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling but carried no sparkle. Heavy curtains blocked out the sun, keeping the rooms dim and stale. Dust lingered in corners like memories refusing to be disturbed. Adrian Blackwell did not greet her. He passed her once in the hallway, his figure tall, his suit perfectly cut, his gaze fixed on the ground as though eye contact was too costly. He said nothing, just a nod, clipped and cold, and then the sound of a door closing behind him. Isabella realized that she wasn't here to be noticed, she was here to make sure the silence remained undisturbed. She opened the first room assigned to her and immediately understood why no one lasted long in this job. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wood polish and grief. She ran her cloth across a table and watched as a thin layer of dust gave way to polished mahogany beneath. For a brief second, the wood seemed alive again, reflecting light, but when she glanced up, the room still felt lifeless. Each space told the same story: wealth abandoned, memories sealed away, no flowers, no laughter, no signs of living, only stillness. And in that stillness, Isabella felt something both haunting and fragile, like standing in the echo of someone else's sorrow. Chapter 2: The Broken Man Behind Wealth. Adrian Blackwell was a name whispered in boardrooms and splashed across financial magazines. At 36, he was the kind of man who could move entire markets with a single decision. His face had been on the covers, his speeches quoted like scripture in the world of business. People envied his empire, his luxury cars, his sprawling mansion. To the world, Adrian was the embodiment of success. But inside those walls Isabella now walked through, success looked very different. She began to notice the details, the way unopened letters piled near the grand piano, the untouched meals returned to the kitchen, the dim corridors where no laughter echoed. It was a house built for life but abandoned to grief. The whispers among the staff told her what money couldn't hide. 2 years earlier, Adrian's wife, Evelyn, had died in a sudden accident. He hadn't been at home. He had been thousands of miles away, closing a deal that would make headlines the next day. By the time he returned, all he found was silence. The mansion that had once been filled with her voice became a hollow space he couldn't bear to leave, yet couldn't escape. Wealth gave him everything, except the one thing he needed most: peace. He could buy art to fill the walls, but not the warmth of a hand waiting for him at night. He could surround himself with employees, yet remain untouched by human presence. Adrian wasn't a man living, he was a man enduring. And Isabella, in her quiet observation, began to see what others ignored. Beneath the billion-dollar fortune stood a man fractured, carrying a grief so heavy it bent even the strongest posture. Chapter 3: A Glimpse of Humanity. Late one evening, when the staff had already gone and the mansion was wrapped in its usual silence, Isabella paused her work. She had been gathering cleaning supplies when a faint sound drifted through the air. It wasn't the creak of floorboards or the hum of machinery. It was something unexpected: piano keys. Hesitant at first, then steady, repeating the same haunting melody. Drawn by the sound, she followed it down the corridor until she reached a half-open door. Inside, in the dim glow of a single lamp, Adrian sat at the grand piano. His back was straight, his hands poised over the keys, but there was no grandeur in his playing. The notes came like whispers, fragile and broken, circling the same tune over and over. Isabella stayed in the shadows, not daring to interrupt, and in that moment, she saw something no magazine or headline had ever captured. The man who appeared untouchable to the world looked unbearably human, haunted, grieving, reaching for something he could never hold again. His fingers trembled slightly as he struck the final chord, letting it linger in the air until silence swallowed it whole. Adrian lowered his head, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of memory pressed down on him. There were no tears on his face, but Isabella recognized grief when she saw it. It was the kind that lived not in eyes, but in the soul. For the first time, she didn't just see the billionaire. She saw the man behind the fortune, a man who once loved deeply, and who was now lost inside his own sorrow. That glimpse of humanity softened something in Isabella's heart. She understood that beneath the cold exterior, there was still life flickering, fragile but real. Chapter 4: The First Words Shared. For days, Isabella had grown used to the rhythm of silence inside the mansion. Adrian passed her in corridors like a shadow, always distant, always wordless. She thought perhaps he would never speak to her at all. But one afternoon, as the golden light slanted through the tall windows of the study, his voice broke the stillness. "Why don't you fear the silence?" His tone wasn't warm, nor hostile, it was curious, almost weary, as though the question had been circling in his mind long before she arrived. Isabella froze, startled to hear him speak. She looked up from the stack of books she was dusting. For a moment, she considered staying quiet, but something in his gaze told her he wasn't asking as a billionaire speaking to an employee. He was asking as a man searching for an answer. "Because sometimes silence says the most," she replied softly. Her voice was steady, unembellished, but the words carried weight. Adrian studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring the truth of her response. For years, silence had been his prison, the heavy cloak he couldn't shed. Yet here was this young woman, treating silence not as a burden but as a presence, something to be respected, even embraced. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it shifted the air between them. For the first time, Isabella felt that she wasn't invisible in this house. And for Adrian, it was the first time he let a stranger step into the echo of his grief. Words had been shared, not many. but enough to remind them both that silence could hold connection as much as distance. Chapter 5: The Weight He Carried. Adrian had always been a man who carried the world on his shoulders. But Isabella began to see he carried something heavier than business deals or market empires. His grief had become a second skin, stitched to him so tightly he could no longer tell where it ended and where he began. It came out in fragments. A late night when he lingered by the piano, his voice barely audible, he spoke of Evelyn, his wife. Her laughter, he said, had once filled the mansion like sunlight spilling into every corner. She loved wildflowers and used to place them in mismatched vases around the house, making the grand estate feel like a home. And then, with one phone call, everything ended. He wasn't there when it happened. That was the wound that cut deepest. He was in another country, chasing another deal, one that would add another zero to a fortune that already meant nothing without her. He returned not to her embrace but to silence, to condolences that felt like stones, to a house too big for one man's sorrow. "I should have been there," he admitted once, his voice breaking on the words. "If I had been home, maybe it would be different." Isabella didn't argue. She didn't try to tell him what wasn't his fault. She knew guilt has a way of digging roots, of convincing even the strongest minds that tragedy was somehow their doing. Instead, she listened, holding the silence open so he could finally release what he had locked away. And in those moments, Isabella understood the true weight Adrian carried. It wasn't his fortune, or his empire. It was absence, the empty chair at dinner, the piano bench no longer shared, the scent of wildflowers that never returned. It was the unbearable heaviness of love without a place to go. Chapter 6: The Listener He Needed. Adrian had sat across from countless powerful people, lawyers, investors, politicians, yet he had never felt heard. Every conversation in his life seemed to come with an agenda, a transaction, a hidden cost. But with Isabella, things were different. She didn't interrupt, didn't attempt to fill the silence with meaningless comfort. She simply listened. There were evenings when Adrian's words stumbled out unevenly, as if his grief had been locked so long he no longer knew how to speak it. He would pause mid-sentence, his voice catching, his eyes drifting toward the floor as though ashamed of the weakness he revealed. But Isabella never looked away. She didn't pity him, she didn't rush to tell him it would be all right. She gave him the dignity of silence, the rare gift of space to lay down his pain. And that silence worked like balm. Slowly, Adrian found himself saying things he hadn't said aloud to anyone. He confessed how he hated the nights most, the way the house creaked with emptiness, the way his own breathing felt too loud without Evelyn beside him. He admitted that wealth felt hollow, every possession a reminder of the one thing he could never own again. Isabella's presence reminded him of something he had forgotten, that sometimes healing doesn't come from advice or answers, but from being witnessed. She didn't try to change his grief, she honored it. And in doing so, she became the listener he didn't know he had been needing all along. For the first time in years, Adrian felt that maybe he wasn't entirely alone in his sorrow. Someone had stepped into the silence with him, and stayed. Chapter 7: Small Acts. Silent Healing. Healing didn't arrive like a storm. It came quietly, almost invisibly, in the smallest of gestures. Isabella never tried to reinvent Adrian's world. She simply touched it with presence, with thoughtfulness, with details so gentle they might have gone unnoticed, except Adrian noticed them. One morning, sunlight spilled into the hall for the first time in months. Isabella had drawn back the heavy curtains, letting golden warmth fall across the cold marble floor. The air shifted, lighter, almost breathable. Adrian paused on the staircase, surprised to see light stretching into corners that had long been hidden. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered on the glow as though he had forgotten what daylight looked like inside his own home. She began leaving fresh flowers on the piano, wildflowers. Not roses or expensive orchids, but simple stems gathered from a market stall. The first time Adrian saw them, his chest tightened. Evelyn had loved wildflowers. The sight was a reminder, but not a painful one. It was a memory softened by care, an offering that didn't demand words. Even the way Isabella moved through the house carried quiet healing. She hummed under her breath sometimes, not loudly enough to fill the rooms, but just enough to remind him that the house was not empty. She left books open on tables, placed chairs slightly closer together, left windows cracked to let in the evening breeze. Each act was so small, yet together they began stitching warmth back into a place that had long felt like a tomb. Adrian never thanked her, not directly, but each time he entered a room and felt it less suffocating. Each time the silence seemed lighter. He found himself breathing a little deeper. And that was thanks enough. Chapter 8. Walls begin to fall. Adrian had built walls around himself higher than the gates of his mansion, walls of silence, of distance, of control. For years, they had kept everyone out. Business partners admired him but never truly knew him. Employees feared him but never dared to reach him. Even family had given up, leaving him in the fortress of his grief. But with Isabella, those walls didn't shatter in some dramatic moment. They began to crumble quietly, almost without him noticing. It started with something as simple as dinner. For months, he had taken his meals alone, trays left at his study door. One evening, however, Isabella was still in the kitchen when he entered. Instead of leaving, she stayed, silently setting another plate across from his. She didn't ask, she didn't invite, she just created the space. And to his own surprise, Adrian sat. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was shared. He found himself noticing the way she folded her napkin carefully, the way her presence softened the cavernous dining hall. For the first time in years, he ate without feeling the sting of loneliness press against every bite. Gradually, he began to let her into other parts of his routine. A walk through the gardens where he once never went. A conversation that lasted longer than a single sentence. A laugh, short, unsteady, but real, slipping out when Isabella told a clumsy story about spilling water on herself while cleaning. Each moment was small, but together, they signaled something Adrian hadn't allowed in years: trust. The fortress of silence was no longer impenetrable. And though he didn't say it aloud, Adrian realized he was no longer living despite someone's presence in the house. He was living because of it. Chapter 9. When pain turns into trust. Trust doesn't appear in grand gestures. It slips quietly into the space between two people, born out of shared silence and unspoken understanding. For Adrian, it came one evening when he entered the study holding a small wooden box. His expression was unreadable, his hands steady but tense, as though the weight of the box was heavier than it should have been. He placed it on the piano and pushed it gently toward Isabella. These were hers, he said simply, his voice carrying a tremor he didn't try to hide. Inside the box lay Evelyn's letters, handwritten notes, postcards, fragments of a life lived with love. Some were folded neatly, others worn at the edges from being read too often. To Adrian, they weren't just paper, they were pieces of her. Fragile proof that she had once been real in a world that now felt like a dream. Isabella hesitated, not because she feared what she might read, but because she understood the sacredness of what he was offering. She didn't reach for the letters. Instead, she rested her hand lightly on the lid, acknowledging them with respect. "You don't need to explain," she whispered. "I'll treat them the way you do." Adrian studied her, searching for even the faintest trace of curiosity, but found none. She didn't hunger for his secrets. She honored them. That was the moment the fortress inside him cracked a little wider. For years, pain had been the only thing he trusted it to return each morning, to haunt him each night. But now, sitting across from this young woman who had done nothing but listen and care, Adrian felt something shift. His pain no longer stood alone. It had become a bridge, a way to trust someone else with the truth of who he was. Chapter 10: Healing Without Knowing. Healing rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with thunder or the turning of seasons. Sometimes, it sneaks in quietly, woven into ordinary moments, until one day you realize you're no longer carrying the same weight. Adrian noticed it in subtle ways. The mansion, once suffocating, no longer felt like a tomb. He caught himself pausing at the windows, watching the sunlight stretch across the floor instead of retreating into shadows. The meals he once ate alone tasted less bitter when shared across the same table. Even the silence between him and Isabella shifted. It wasn't empty anymore, it was full, alive, like a language only the two of them understood. He couldn't pinpoint when it began. Maybe it was the flowers she placed on the piano. Maybe it was her quiet presence in the dining hall. Or maybe it was simply the way she never demanded, never tried to erase his grief, but allowed it to exist without shame. Slowly, without realizing it, Adrian was breathing differently. His shoulders weren't as heavy, his steps not as hollow. One night, as he sat in the study, he realized the house no longer echoed the same way. The walls felt warmer. The rooms didn't press down on him like they used to. For the first time in years, he could close his eyes without being afraid of the memories that would come. He never told Isabella she was healing him. He doubted she even knew. But in the quiet rhythm of her presence, in the small gestures she left behind, Adrian found something he thought he'd buried forever: the possibility of peace. Outro. Healing rarely looks the way we expect. Adrian never asked Isabella to fix him. She never promised she could. And yet, through her quiet presence, her silence, and her small gestures, she gave him what years of wealth and power could not: a way to breathe again. In the end, what Adrian thanked her for was not cleaning his mansion, but for healing his soul. She didn't erase his grief, because grief is not something you erase. Instead, she reminded him that grief can exist alongside life. That sorrow doesn't have to be the end of love, but a quiet echo of it. Maybe that's the lesson this story leaves with us. We don't always need answers, or solutions, or grand gestures to help someone. Sometimes, what we need most is to be present, to truly listen, to hold space for another person's pain without judgment. Healing often begins not in words, but in being seen and understood. And now, I want to ask you, what part of this story spoke to you the most? Was it the silence that turned into trust, the small acts of care, or the reminder that even the wealthiest among us carry invisible wounds? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this touched you. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more stories like this, narratives that whisper to the heart, that remind us of the humanity we all share, no matter how much we've lost or gained. Because sometimes, the most powerful healing doesn't come from noise, it comes in whispers. And here, we tell those whispers out loud.